Why is danzón so important for salsa's timing? Well, danzón is one of the social dance ancestors of what we call salsa today. And danzón is actually the national dance of Cuba. And within danzón, we get some of the first manifestations of contratiempo timing. This is what we now call dancing salsa on two. So understanding the roots of salsa's timing, understanding that cultural context really helps us to see why we step the way we do, and it helps us to embody salsa's timing even deeper. The history of the danzón is a very unique and intriguing story. One of the first danzones was said to be created in 1879 by Miguel Failde. The name of this danzón was called Las Alturas de Simpson, which literally means Simpson Heights. This was an area in western Cuba, specifically the city of Matanzas, a very important city because of its large port. Now, the danzón can be said to be traced back even earlier out of the eastern part of the island from the contradanza, which was a European court dance introduced into the eastern part of Cuba by the French, the Spanish, and the British. This court dance was very formal in its structure, was danced in couples, and the couples would execute very particular figures and formations. The movement aesthetic and the style of these dances was very formalized. It had a particular European movement aesthetic, which really emphasized posture and had a specific frame. One of the main reasons why the contradanza was introduced into the eastern side of Cuba was because of the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 1700s. Remember that Haiti was the biggest distributor of sugar at the time, up until the Haitian Revolution. Then many of the people in the sugar business went and fled to the nearest place, which was the eastern part of Cuba, the Oriente. And this is when the contradanza, the social dances of the European court, started to intertwine with the social dances of the enslaved community at the time. And one of these communities, which is very important to this story, is called the tumba francesa. And the reason why the tumba francesa is so important is because one rhythmic instrument that was played, called the kata, with two sticks, a hollowed out piece of wood played by two sticks, this rhythm that was played, which has Afro-Haitian roots, was incorporated into the contradanza and would later be the main key rhythm that would distinguish what we know as danzón. This is what makes the danzón so fascinating, because the danzón is one of the first creolized versions of music and dance in Cuba. You can see this primarily in the orchestras that played danzón. They were called orquestas típicas. And in these orchestras, you would have European instruments, you would have indigenous instruments, and you would have African instruments all playing in one band at once. So now this is where it gets really interesting, because that key rhythm, that syncopated key rhythm that was introduced into the contradanza with its Afro-Haitian roots from the kata, this rhythm influenced not only the music, but it influenced the footwork of the dancers. So if you look at danzón, if you look at how it's danced, you can see the upper half is very upright in posture, very formalized in frame. But if you look down to the feet, you can see how the feet are sliding on the ground, marking out that contratiempo time step. And this is what makes danzón one of the first contratiempo or on-two time steps that was on the island. Another interesting feature to note about the danzón was who played the danzón. And this is a very interesting thing, because we have to remember that the danzón really got going in the 19th century, and this is at the height of the Cuban Wars for Independence. And this is what makes the danzón such a hybridized type of music, is because many enslaved African people were actually enlisted into the wars to fight against the other colonial powers that were trying to take the island at the time. We have the military bands, and the military bands would include not only white people, but also black people. And these orquestas típicas were some of the first interracial bands that would exist on the island at the time. And this is one of the main reasons how the African rhythmic aesthetics, African music theory, African instruments, and indigenous instruments were able to be incorporated into some of the more European styles of music and European styles of instruments, and they intertwine and intermingle together to create that essence of what is known as danzón. A little bit about how danzón was danced. Danzón, even though it was a social dance, it had a very particular structure. It was very formalized in its structure. And this was a representation of the colonial time that the danzón was born in. So the danzón actually started with what was called a paseo. And the paseo was an introduction. The dancers didn't dance yet. They would walk on the dance floor, they would choose their partners, and they would get ready to dance. They would get into their frame, into their position. But here's where the important thing is for salsa timing. When the danzón dancers began their step, it actually begun not on the first beat of the measure, it begun on the fourth beat of the measure. And this is what is called contratiempo, against time. Now the dancers would begin on the fourth beat, and this would create sort of like a leading step that would lead into the second beat. So you can see how this is where the origins of salsa on two that we know today came from. It came from the danzón. So you can see as partners would dance, they would get into the next paseo section, and they would rest again, socialize, and then get back into dancing. This A-B structure was very prevalent in a lot of the contradanza and a lot of the European court dances. And eventually this structure evolved into more of a son structure, which we'll talk about in the son video. But as you can see, the danzón really had a connection to timing, it had a connection to the music, and it had a connection with the partner that all created that social dance court atmosphere and the essence of danzón that we know today. So eventually the danzón would evolve. It would break out of the formalized structures that it had. It would become more loose, and different sections were added to its original structure. One section in particular was called the montuno section. And the montuno section was an inspiration from some of the countryside music happening on the eastern side of the island, such as changui and son. This montuno section actually started to set the stage for new styles such as mambo, cha-cha-cha, and eventually the salsa that we know today. So every time you dance salsa on two, you're dancing the DNA of danzón. The pauses, the footwork, the syncopation, and the fusion of African and European movement aesthetics. So in conclusion, danzón is basically the root of Cuban social dance. And when we understand this, this gives us a bigger respect for the rhythms that we embody on the salsa floor today.